They say money is power, and for centuries, women have been fighting to claim both. Today, we're talking with journalist and author Josie Cox about what's changed, what hasn't, and what role AI might play in shaping the future of gender equity. Welcome to the AI Empowered Mom Podcast. We are on a mission to reduce the mental load of parenthood using AI assistance. And today I'm joined by journalist, author, and broadcaster Josie Cox, whose work has appeared in Bloomberg, The Guardian, The New York Times, and beyond. She's the author of Women, Money, Power, The Rise and Fall of Economic Equality, and one of my favorite voices on the fabulous podcast, The Work Behind the Work. Today, we're going to talk about gender equity, AI, and why it matters for moms. Josie, welcome. I'm so happy to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Sarah. It's great to see you.
Can you start by telling us a little bit more about your professional background as a journalist and an author?
Sure, absolutely. So you can probably tell from my accent that I'm not originally from the US. I was actually born and raised in Europe. I grew up in Switzerland, which you probably also wouldn't guess from my accent. My dad was British. My mom was from Eastern Europe. So I'm kind of a mishmash. I did my undergrad in the UK and really loved, the prospect of carving out a career in which I could spend time speaking to people, quite frankly. I think humans are fascinating, and what better way to spend a career than speaking to people and hearing their stories and telling their stories as well. So unfortunately, I graduated right into the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. So my timing was immaculate. But I was lucky in that I had grown up speaking German. So that gave me a bit of a superpower, especially because the Eurozone crisis was such a big news story at the time. And so I was lucky in that I was offered this reporting internship at Reuters, one of the biggest news organizations in the world. I went, I did it. I rolled up my sleeves and asked all the dumb questions, and lo and behold, got offered a full-time job as a junior markets reporter. Now, finance, my goodness, not something I expected, right? I'm a liberal arts major. I am terrible at math, which surprises a lot of people. But, I wanted to be a journalist and I wanted to get my foot in the door, and I knew that that was going to come at a cost. And so I threw myself into the challenge, got myself a subscription to the FT and the Wall Street Journal and the Economist, and learned as much as I could, and became a markets reporter. And pretty quickly I realized that markets reporting and financial reporting isn't really about numbers and math. It's about humans, and it's about decisions, and it's about impulses and power and all those things that are really, really interesting to me. And so I stuck with it. I learned to love it. I really kind of developed a passion for reporting on those types of stories and the economy. And then fast forward a little bit, I was at Reuters for a few years. I joined the Wall Street Journal as a markets reporter in London. I then became business editor at The Independent, which is a national newspaper in the UK. And then I had a baby, and then everything changed.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is that, I had really started kind of carving out this beat for myself at the intersection of the economy and women and gender and inequality, and really kind of delving into that part of markets that fascinated me. And somehow I sort of believed, I think in the back of my mind, that I would be immune to the motherhood penalty that I was writing about, and I would somehow be immune to the gender pay gap that I was writing about. And when I became a mom, I realized that I was actually living all of these stories that I had been reporting. And that I myself was finding that I was having to make these decisions between prioritizing career and family, between, prioritizing kind of professional accomplishments and my sort of personal ambitions. And so, that only really cemented my resolve to make this my focus and to really use my platform as a journalist to tell these stories and to delve into this topic. And so I did. I ended up going freelance, which we can talk about if you want. That was a decision I had to make. And, a few years later, finally sort of plucked up the courage to write a book about it. And it's not a book about me. It's not in any way memoir, but it has got a lot of me in it because I feel so passionate about this topic of women's economic empowerment. I'm also a history nerd. So, I love the idea of delving into history to explain the present. And Women, Money, Power is exactly that. It's an exploration of our collective history in the US. I moved here in 2020. Since the Second World War, kind of tracking women's economic empowerment over the last 100 years to effectively answer this question of why we are where we are today. Why do we still have this pretty substantial gender pay gap? Why do we still have women's labor force participation gap between genders? Why do so many women find themselves in a situation where they have to choose between family and career? And so that's how I ended up where I am today and speaking to you.
Well, I do want to know about that choice that you referenced, the choice about going freelance and what that has to do with women, money, and power.
I'm risk averse. I know that a lot of journalists start out in their careers wanting to be freelance and loving this idea of autonomy and independence and, staking out their own path. That was not me. I always wanted to work for a news organization. I wanted a boss. I wanted a desk. I wanted an office. I wanted those kind of parameters of certainty around me. But when I had my daughter in 2018, 7 years ago, I just quickly realized that, childcare and the workday do not align, not only in terms of the actual hours that are available and that we have to work, but also in terms of the cost. If I was going to put my child in childcare, assuming I could even find care for the hours that I spent in the newsroom, a huge portion of my salary would go straight to that daycare or that individual who was going to be looking after my daughter. And it just didn't make financial sense. I couldn't justify it. And so it was sort of a decision I made. I couldn't see the labor market working for me and for my needs and for my daughter's needs and for my husband's needs too at that moment. And so I made this decision to go freelance, which, I also have to acknowledge is a privilege, right? The reason I could go freelance was because my husband had a stable job with a good income. He was the breadwinner. I have his healthcare benefits and other benefits that
Right.
we don't want to do away with. And so I was able to make that decision to go freelance because of the particular situation that I was in. But so many people don't have that. So, it's a lot of soul searching and a lot of kind of reflection and learning. And I do think that my own experience has really informed my life as a reporter in direct and indirect ways as well.
Well, your experience really resonates with me. I too had a daughter in 2018. And at that time, my husband and I were both consultants. We traveled Monday through Thursday. So something had to give,
Yeah.
quite literally, but very, very similar. The
Yeah.
markets weren't working for us. What's family life like for you now that you are freelance? Is it working for you?
Yeah, I mean, define working, right? I think any working parent will know that every day is a new adventure and every day is a game of Tetris, right? Where you're trying to fit in all the parts and figure out, make sure that the things that can't fall down don't fall down. There are some things that can, but there are some things you can't compromise. I work very flexibly. I arrange my schedule around my daughter's schedule, around school. We're speaking at the end of summer, right? Summer has been a journey, a patchwork of summer camps and babysitters and whatnot. And that's always challenging. So, but I think, we as a family have really worked through this together. And my husband and I pride ourselves on having really clear communication and talking about everything. Even though I pick up the bulk of childcare during the week, that is a decision that the two of us make. And there are compromises he makes and there are compromises I make. And it is, it's a living kind of dynamic situation that can change at any time. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. So yeah, every day is different.
Well, Josie, last year you wrote a powerful Bloomberg piece that really spoke right to my heart and the why behind the AI empowered mom community. And it was about how women are less likely to use AI. At that time, adoption was lagging between women and men. So, can you share a little bit about that piece and some of the reasons that you surfaced in the article about women lagging
Yeah,
behind?
totally. So first off, a couple of things. One is that I had never written about AI. So I was quite daunted by this topic. And, you know, um, one of the reasons I pitched it to the commissioning editor was that I anecdotally was noticing that a lot of the women in my life, colleagues, acquaintances, friends, family, were very risk averse and were not really interested in exploring AI. And a lot of their male counterparts were really kind of enthusiastically embracing it and experimenting and playing with it and using it in their lives and in their jobs as well. And I just thought this was really striking. Now, of course, my sample size was tiny. So the first thing I did was set out to get some real representative data, which surprisingly at the time was quite hard to find. You know, timelines are like weird in this world of AI because everything moves so fast. But even in November last year, which is really not that long ago, there was just not that much data out in terms of adoption. One thing that I did find was this study that had been done by the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland, in my home country, by coincidence, using Fed data from the US. The caveat being that the sample size was relatively small. It was about 900 people. But they did establish that the adoption rate of AI was much higher for men than women. I think it was something like 50% versus 37%. So 50% of men said that over the last, I think it was 12 months, had used AI and also used it regularly. And only about 37% of women did. 37 is still quite a high number, but that is a significant difference between those two figures. And so that in itself was interesting, but what I thought was even more interesting was why, right? And so I started digging. I spoke to economists and psychologists and psychiatrists, and I interviewed the CEO of the world's biggest job recruitment agency, which was fascinating, just to kind of figure out why this is, and B, what the impact could be. And what I found in terms of the reasons was twofold. One was that women, they implied that they didn't have the knowledge and the understanding of AI and that technology. And two was that they were more risk averse when it came to things like privacy and security. I think those two things are linked, because I think if you don't have the knowledge, that means that there's a barrier to being able to use it. And if you're generally more risk averse, then you're not going to acquire the knowledge that you need to feel comfortable using a particular technology. But if you sort of dig one more layer deeper, the reason for this I thought was absolutely fascinating. So contrary to what some people believe, it didn't seem to me, based on my research, that there was a biological difference in the way that women and men feel about technology. It was down to social conditioning. So what we know is that in the workplace, generally, especially in male-dominated workplaces, which are still many, the cost of failure is much higher for women. So what does that mean? It means if they screw up, if they fail, if they do something wrong, the repercussions are going to be more severe than if they were a man, right? And so if we have been conditioned as women to understand that that is the case, then we're naturally going to be more reluctant to try something new, to try something that kind of, sticks our neck out a little bit. So that's absolutely fascinating. As for the repercussions of that, the CEO who I just mentioned of the recruitment agency, he said it to me in such a kind of stark way. He said, look, AI is a production tool. It's a tool for being productive. And so if you're not using that, you're not going to be as productive, right? And if you're not as productive, you're not going to make as much money. So there is this direct line between using AI and earnings, and therefore between using AI and the gender pay gap. So, the conclusion that the piece ultimately draws is that, yes, if we allow this adoption gap to sustain, then we are going to be looking at an exacerbation of the gender pay gap. And that is really scary.
Well, what was the response? What kind of response did you get to this?
I think so. I mean, it resonated. I think it did encourage some people. Just anecdotally, I heard that people felt more encouraged to experiment, to play around, knowing that ultimately, in most cases, the consequences of failure, whatever that means, are not really there. Like if you just kind of download an AI, a ChatGPT or whatever, and you play around with it in your home, chances are nothing bad's going to happen. And so I think I did really encourage people to just try, to just have a go and see what happens. But I think broadly, there has been more of a conversation about this over the last 6 months. I've been really encouraged by organizations that have popped up encouraging kind of tech literacy, AI literacy. And I think there's sort of a general understanding of this connection between sort of economic empowerment and AI, which I know is very much at the heart of what you're doing. And I think that's encouraging. I think more work still needs to be done, but I think a bit of traction is certainly there.
What about AI in your life? How have you personally navigated AI adoption for your life or for your work?
Yeah, it's so interesting because even just reporting that story caused me to reflect on my own habits and my own use. Truly, before I started reporting the piece, I myself was a pretty reluctant user of generative AI and similar technologies. But I really vowed that I was not going to fall into this pattern of being one of those people who, sort of ignored it and thought maybe it'll go away, because clearly it's not. So I have really started using it more in ways that are perhaps expected and unexpected. I do tend to use it in a way that I would use a search engine when I'm starting off researching for a piece that I'm reporting, or a bigger project that I'm working on. I'd certainly be more inclined these days to go to a generative AI tool than Google or a similar search engine. And then one thing I found really interesting is that it has helped me to kind of get an overview of sourcing in some cases. So I would never use it in itself as a source.
Sure.
But if I go to ChatGPT or similar and I type in, is there any credible representative data on the adoption of AIs along gender lines? It is pretty good at sourcing academic papers that are credible. And then I can go to the source of that paper. I can call up the economist or the academic or whoever has created the paper. And it just kind of helps me to create that map of my research and my work, which I find really useful.
As a productivity tool.
Right. There you go. Yeah, totally. Yeah. Also, it's an excellent sort of typo spotter. Like I find, you can paste something in and say, what are the typos in here? It's caught some really interesting dates. I've been writing a lot about history recently and how, the evolution of history to explain the present moment. And the number of times it's asked me whether I mean 2010, not 1810. It's been really helpful. So just to kind of give it that overview, common one. Totally. Yeah.
Well, one thing there's so many things to love about women money power, but one that I loved was just walking through history and thinking about how money and economic inequality has shaped the gender experience. And I wonder about in 5 or 10 or 50 years, what the chapter on AI would look like
Mm,
and how we might take the lessons from history and apply them to the way that women might adopt and use AI today. Is there anything that you can share,
yeah.
any lessons from Women Money Power that you could share about the AI age for women?
Yeah, I think it's sort of what we were just talking about. So certainly the fact that AI could be a powerful tool for helping to close the gender pay gap, but it could also be a tool that exacerbates it. So I think we have to understand the stakes and we have to understand what's the risks that are involved here if we sort of let this adoption gap, continue. So I think that's one part. I think the other part is, one thing I've thought about a lot is who designs these systems, right? And through history, what we've seen is that the people who design the systems are also tend to be the people who benefit from the systems most, be that the labor market, be that, childcare or whatever. You need the individuals with a vested interest in that system to have a part in designing it, in creating it and thinking it through. And so I'm really encouraged when I see women working in AI, when I see women in tech generally, women engineers, women who are kind of thinking through these pain points and the evolution of these technologies and how they can be tools for good. And so, that I think would be, I mean, the book, because that's what you asked, the book is very much like profiles of women through history who have contributed to women's economic empowerment in some big way. And I'm excited over the next few years to learn about the women who are, building AIs, who are creating their own path and who are doing so, knowing that their work is going to have a, positive impact on the lives of women across the world.
Me too.
Yeah.
Jesse, what about the dads? We've been talking about working moms and women and gender equality, but you recently published a piece on Business Insider about millennial dads.
Yeah.
And I wonder about, as we're talking about AI and supporting moms, if we make an effort to support moms, are we penalizing dads? Is this a zero-sum game?
No, I mean, nothing is a zero-sum game. That's sort of my mantra over the last year or so. I've really started paying more attention since the book came out, really. And also, as I was reporting the kind of final stages of the book, one thing I realized was that often when we talk about women's economic empowerment, we're talking about one side of the coin, right? We're talking about women who have made these great monumental strides in the labor market, who are now doing the jobs that were previously the domain of men, who are making more than men. There are more female breadwinners in the US than ever before in history. All of this is progress to be celebrated. But it is so important to equally have a conversation about the man's role, right? And dad's roles. And if we're not talking about men moving into roles that were traditionally dominated by women, i.e., caring roles, and I'm talking about roles both in the paid labor market and in the unpaid labor market. So if we can, sure, maybe we're getting better at accepting a woman in the C-suite, but are we getting better at accepting a stay-at-home dad?
Right.
And until we nail both sides of that equation, we can't really talk about meaningful progress. So yeah, that's why I wrote that piece. I think it's really important to acknowledge that men have their own version of the conversation about having it all.
Right.
And I got a little bit of kickback for that.
Well, it struck me when I learned that none of the dads that you interviewed would go on record. So that tells me we do have much work to do here.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so frustrating because I think it's so important to tell their stories. And that's why I decided to tell their stories anyway. When I do my reporting, I much prefer to have people on the record who I can quote by full name, with their identities. But I wanted to respect the fact that this speaks to the problem at hand, right? And the shame element as well. And the fact that men are, in some cases, really kind of grappling with this question of what their role is in society. How can they be a force for good? How can they themselves evolve and change and adapt and embrace, women while also, doing things that are fulfilling for them?
Right. Well, it's a data point and a compelling data point that they wouldn't. So I'm glad you continued to tell the
Thank you.
story. Well, let's switch gears and go into what I'm affectionately calling chatbot mode, but this time you're the chatbot. So, first, I want to know what's the one myth about gender equity that you would love to bust forever? Bust a myth.
Yeah, I speak to this in the prologue of the book, so maybe if you've read the book, you'll remember it. But this idea that women are less ambitious than men, and that ambition is the reason for the gender pay gap. It's BS, excuse my French, and I just wish it would go away.
And what about a surprising way that you have used AI? We talked a little bit about how you use it for work
Mm,
to find typos and help you with sources. Any other fun ways that you can share?
yes, therapy.
Tell me more.
I've always been a big fan of therapy. I'm going through a period right now where I haven't got a great therapist. I haven't found someone who really clicks, and I've just, of course, I know that AI is not human and therefore doesn't have the same sort of sensitivities and judgments. And of course, there are limitations. But I do think that one of the great things about therapy is that it helps you reframe something.
Mhm.
And I do think that AI has the ability to do that to a certain extent. And I have really used it as a sounding board for just kind of working through tricky situations as a parent, as a mom, as a worker, as a wife, whatever it might be.
I saw in the new release, in the new GPT-5 model from ChatGPT,
Mhm.
you can even switch the personality of ChatGPT into listening mode, which is like so perfect for when you need that sounding
I've
board.
not tried that, but maybe I will.
What about a woman from Women Money Power that you hold close to your heart and think more people should know about?
So many. How long have you got? I mean, the person who I just cannot believe is not a household name is Pauli Murray, who was a civil rights advocate, a poet. She was this incredible human being. She was Eleanor Roosevelt's long-term pen pal, confidant, advisor. She was a mentor to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the late Supreme Court Justice. And she crafted a lot of the civil rights legislation that we all rely on today, regardless of gender, race, etc. She was absolutely tremendous, amazing, remarkable woman who accomplished so much, who also dealt with a lot of personal struggles. She was probably gender fluid, though didn't have the terminology to describe it as such at the time. And it was just such a privilege to delve into her story. And as a result of the book, I got to know some of her family members as well, which has just been, I have no words to describe the joy and the privilege that I feel from having the opportunity to do that.
How wonderful. Polly Murray. Let's say her name, learn about her, and look her
Yes.
up
Go look
in
her up. Go
ChatGPT.
look her up. Yeah.
um,
Recently wrote a essay about her for Ms. Magazine. So that's a good source.
what about a book or a podcast that has inspired you?
So many. You briefly mentioned the work behind the work, which I was involved in recently, which I think does such a tremendous job of dispelling the myths of gender gaps in the workforce, of the childcare crisis. Melissa Panzer, who's behind the podcast, is amazing. She's such an incredible storyteller, and I was so lucky to be involved. So definitely that. And then, unexpected places. I feel like I'm reading a lot of history at the moment to make sense of the current situation that we're in terms of women's rights, in terms of, stalling of the gender pay gap and the childcare crisis and all of that. And I do find that history helps to contextualize and also to understand that we have overcome struggles before and that people have walked before us and have paved the way. And I'm drawing a lot of inspiration from that. And then it's so funny. I used to almost exclusively read nonfiction. And over the last maybe year or two, I started reading novels. And it's funny, I'm going around and being like, you guys should check out a novel sometime, as if I've discovered fiction, which is hilarious. But and I recently read Taylor Jenkins Reid's new book,
Atmosphere?
Atmosphere,
I
which
loved
is,
it.
oh my goodness, it's so good.
It went too fast. I read it too quickly. I wish I
Yeah.
could have spent more
But
time there.
just I love novels that, that challenge stereotypes and that normalize women in male dominated professions historically. And so
Goodness.
it just is such an amazing, it does such an amazing job of that. And it's just a thing of joy, and I loved it. I loved it.
Women in male dominated positions, a beautiful love story between
Yes.
women, which I don't
Yeah.
read enough
Right.
of.
Yeah.
And also, I grew up in Houston, so it's
Oh,
so
yeah.
captures Houston in the '80s in such a way that took me right back there.
Yeah. That's so nice.
I love that
Yeah.
recommendation.
So
Well,
good.
Josie, we always try and celebrate wins, help moms celebrate their wins. Can you share a recent win of yours that we can celebrate here in our community?
Sure. I am working on a new book.
You are?
Yeah.
Congratulations. Can you
Thank you.
share anything about it?
And not too much, but it is in the spirit of what I was saying about history and
Mhm.
in the spirit of what I was saying about women in history who have done tremendous things and who are perhaps not as well known as they should be. So I'm spending a lot of time in archives at the moment, leafing through dusty letters and papers that people haven't read for 100 years. And I'm so excited to share more, hopefully, in the next couple of months.
Oh, I just can't wait. Well, any final thoughts? What's one final thing you hope women in the AI empowered mom community and dads can take away from this conversation?
I just, I think be curious in terms of AI. I think that playing, experimenting never hurt anyone. So really using all the powers, all the tools that are at your disposal to empower yourself. Just I'm also an instructor in communication. I'm a big advocate for communicating. And I do think that we need to generally do a better job of communicating, of speaking to each other, of having conversations about inequality, both at home and in the workplace. And so, talk to each other.
Well, thank you so much, Josie. My takeaway from today is that not using AI doesn't protect moms and women in our families and women at work. In fact, it risks widening the gap between the genders. And if we want to shape the future, we need that seat at the table. And AI is just one little tool of many that can help claim it. And if today sparks something for folks listening, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to me at contact@aiempoweredmom.com. You can find me at AI Empowered Mom on Instagram and TikTok. And I hope that you will read Women Money Power wherever books are sold. Josie and an amazing cast of collaborators like Reshma Shujani and Eve Brodsky on the Work Behind the Work podcast. People can follow along on Josie's Instagram at josie.cox. Thank you again for being here today. It means so much.
Thank you for having me.